we are going to discuss about the sagittal section of the head and neck. So the primary focus of this slide or this specimen is basically going to be the nasal area, the palatal area, the oral area and the pharynx. The first structure that you can see over here, that is a sagittal section of HNN, head and neck, is over here on the top. You can see that we have the medial surface of the brain. Here you can see that this is the corpus callosum, right? The corpus callosum, which is going to join together or acts as a bridge between the two cerebral hemispheres. Then coming downwards, you can see over here the brainstem. We have the pons, we have the medulla, and then the spinal cord. On the anterior aspect, if you can see, this is the frontal bone. So we have discussed in the class as well that the frontal bone has ear sinuses, which is known as the frontal ear sinuses. So this is the frontal ear sinus. So we know that we have 4 sinuses or the paranasal sinuses present on the face. The first one is the frontal ear sinus. The second one, if you go backwards, we are going to see over here the sphenoidal ear sinus. If you remember, this area belongs to the sella turcica. And in the sella turcica, we have the pituitary gland. Now, on the inferior relation of the pituitary gland, we saw that we had the sphenoidal ear sinus. So here we have the sphenoidal ear sinus. We are also going to have the ethmoidal ear sinus, which is going to be present just above here, जिनका opening हम सबको inferior aspect of this concha हमें दिखाई देगा, which we are going to discuss a bit now. Now, coming downwards, if you see this is the nasal area. This is the lateral wall of the nasal area. The middle wall of the nasal part has been removed, that is the septum. Basically, the nasal wall is formed, the medial wall of the nasal area is formed by bony contribution as well as the cartilaginous contribution. Here you can see that this is the hard palate, which we have discussed in the class, formed by the palatine process of the maxilla and posteriorly by the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Attached to the posterior margin of the hard palate, you can see this structure. This is the soft palate. Going below the soft palate, you can see here we have the substance of the tongue. This is the substance of the tongue. This is the mandible. Going downwards, this is the epiglottis. Okay, now let's look at the nasal part first. The nasal area, as you can see, we have removed the medial wall, which is basically consists of a bony part and a cartilaginous part. The bony part will be contributed by the ethmoidal plate, which is going to come downwards over here, and also contribution will be from the vomer. So the vomer and the ethmoid is going to form the bony contribution. The second contribution will be on the anterior part, which is going to be the cartilaginous area. Now here what we can see is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, the bones that basically take contribution or take part are the nasal bone. We are going to have the lacrimal bone. We will have the frontal process of the maxilla. Going backwards, we are going to have the sphenoid bone, the medial plate of the sphenoid bone, which is going to be over here. On the wall, on the lateral wall, you can see the contribution coming from this area. These 3 bony marges or bony arches are known as conchas. So we have 3 conchas. This is the superior concha, this is the medial concha, and this is the inferior concha. So this is the superior concha, this is the medial concha, and this is the inferior concha. Now this superior concha and the medial concha, they are basically extensions from the ethmoid labyrinth. And the inferior nasal concha, this is a separate bone. So these 2, superior and the middle nasal concha, they belong to the ethmoidal bone. Whereas the inferior nasal concha, this is an independent bone, it is an individual bone. In between the conchas, you can see the presence of these small spaces, right? Now these small spaces are known as meatus. So here in between the superior and the middle concha, you can see the meatus. This is the superior meatus. In between the middle and the inferior concha, which we have basically dissected over here, this is going to be the middle meatus. And the third one is going to be this one. This is the inferior meatus. So when you lift up the inferior nasal concha, on the inferior nasal concha and the inferior meatus, we are basically going to find the opening of the nasolacrimal duct. We have the opening of the nasolacrimal duct on the inferior meatus. Just as when we reflect the middle concha upwards, you can see that on the posterior part, you can see this elevated area. This elevated area is known as, it is a bony prominence and is known as the ethmoidal bulla. This is the ethmoidal bulla. And the openings that you can see over here, these are the openings of the middle ethmoidal sinuses, which is also one of the 4 paranasal sinuses. So in the ethmoidal bulla, we are going to have the opening of the middle ethmoidal sinuses. Just beneath the ethmoidal bulla, you can see that we have a semilunar area. This semilunar area is basically known as hiatus semilunaris. This is the hiatus semilunaris. Now, in the hiatus semilunaris, on the anterior part, what you can appreciate is on the upper part, see, this is the frontal sinus. So this frontal sinus, along with the anterior ethmoidal sinus, is going to open on the anterior part of this hiatus semilunaris. On the middle part, we are going to have the opening of the maxillary sinus, which is one of the largest paranasal sinus. Now, so these are the 2 major openings that you will see on the hiatus semilunaris. On the anterior part, we have the opening of the anterior ethmoidal sinus along with the frontal ear sinus. On the middle part, just beneath the ethmoidal bulla, we will have the opening of the maxillary ear sinus. On the upper part, this one, see, on the inferior meatus, we had the opening of the nasolacrimal duct. On the medial meatus, we had the opening, that is the hiatus semilunaris. We had the opening of the frontal sinus, anterior ethmoidal sinus, and the maxillary ear sinus. In the ethmoidal bulla, we had the opening of the middle ethmoidal ear sinuses. Now, this is the superior meatus. On the superior meatus, we are going basically on the posterior part, we will receive the openings of the posterior ethmoidal sinuses. Just behind to this meatus, on the upper part here, this space is basically known as the sphenoidal recess. This is the sphenoidal ethmoidal recess, right? The sphenoid ethmoidal recess. And this sphenoid ethmoidal recess is basically going to receive the openings of the sphenoidal ear sinuses. So these are the openings which we have to see. On the superior meatus, we will have the opening for the posterior ethmoidal sinus. Just going backwards, we have the sphenoid ethmoidal recess, which has the opening of the sphenoidal ear sinuses. Beneath the middle concha, we have the hiatus semilunaris, which receives the opening of, which has the opening of the anterior ethmoidal sinus and the frontal sinuses and the maxillary sinus. The bony projection that you can see over here, this is the ethmoidal bulla, which receives the the opening of the middle ethmoidal sinuses. And on the inferior meatus, we are going to have the opening of the nasolacrimal duct.